Evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the fourth edition of Curmudgeonly Conversation. Our first three guests have been Mark Kreslins, talking about the spirit of 1776, the principles of the Declaration of Independence, and how we might apply them today. Scott Horton, everyone's favorite foreign policy analyst, a walking encyclopedia on this topic, who delivered a very energizing and informative discussion with us. And our most recent curmudgeonly conversation was with Jim Bovard, world-famous public policy hooligan, a libertarian analyst, author of 10 books, and always on the front lines of fighting for liberty, whether it's going through the gauntlet of the TSA or writing in USA Today or doing any of those things of that nature, including keeping us updated on just what really happened at Ruby Ridge and the role of Attorney General Barr in paving the way for those FBI snipers or snipers to get off scot-free. Well, tonight we're honored to have the great Mike Maharrey, hockey goalie extraordinaire, nullification expert who's written 3 books on the topic. He's the communications director of the 10th Amendment Center, and as good fortune would have it, we are talking to him on the 10th anniversary of his association with the 10th Amendment Center. And Mike also is a communications director, I think I have this right, Mike, but correct me if I get it wrong, for Shift Gold. He has a website and Facebook page called Godarchy that explores the intersection of Christian faith and politics and liberty. And so he does podcasts for those that are very, very good. And he also has Thoughts from a Hairy Head that come out. And today he did a 10th talk with Jose Alberto Nino from Venezuela. Some of you have seen him write for the Liberty Conservative and for Mises. And they were talking about gun control and things of that nature, why that's such a pernicious initiative on the part of governments. But right now, let's welcome Mike Maharrey on the 10th anniversary of his association with the 10th Amendment Center. Mike, how you doing?
I'm doing great, Dennis. Thanks for having me on. You know, that's a great group of curmudgeons to join. Bovard, Horton, and Kreslins.
Yes.
Kreslins is the chief curmudgeon.
Well, curmudgeons unite.
I think we should nominate him since he was first. He can be the chief head curmudgeon.
And we will tell him what he would hear from Joshua Lyons to guest on their show. Mark, you are not forgotten.
No,
never. Show, right? Well, that's true. So Mike, tell us how you happened to become affiliated with the 10th Amendment Center and with Michael Bolden, who started that wonderful group in his Los Angeles apartment. How did that happen, and what was your journey to that in terms of personally meeting him, but also philosophically, your journey along the way there?
Yeah, that's a good story. You know, honestly, that's the 10th Amendment Center. I call that my gateway, the gateway drug into the quote-unquote liberty movement, as people like to call it. I mean, that was really what introduced me to libertarian and ultimately anarcho-capitalist or voluntarist or whatever word you want to use that nobody knows the meaning of. But yeah, it was my first article with the 10th Amendment Center was actually published on August 11th. And since then I've published I think over 2,800 articles and blogs for 10th Amendment Center. Isn't that crazy?
Wow.
Yeah. But yeah, you know, I was one of those people that kind of got caught up in the whole Tea Party movement back in 2008, 2009 after the election of Barack Obama. I guess that was his second. No, that was his first term, right? Yeah.
Yeah, first term.
But so yeah, you know, the Tea Party kind of blew up, and there was a pretty active group here in my hometown of Lexington, Kentucky, and I remember really specifically when I decided I needed to get involved and do something more. It was at a Tea Party rally. It was on April 15th or 16th. It's right around tax day in 2009. And it was a rainy day, and I was out in this park, and you know, there's a whole bunch of people out there. It was a real good group, and had some local personalities who spoke, and I was out there. I think I had a sign. I don't remember what the sign said, but I kind of remember having a sign. And it occurred to me as I was standing out there in the rain with this group of people that, if I really believe that this is an important thing, if it's really important to get politically involved, I thought, I need to do something more than stand in the rain and hold a sign, because that's really not going to accomplish anything in the big scheme of things. And I had recently graduated with my journalism degree from the University of South Florida, so I was interested in kind of plugging in somewhere where I could do some writing. And so I started just exploring, looking for places where I might have a fit. And at this point, I was Mr. Neocon. So if there was a war on, I was for it. I was a big Rush Limbaugh, kind of that Republican. But I always had this kind of innate belief in the idea of limited government. I didn't understand at that point that Republicans didn't believe in limited government. I thought all Republicans were limited government. That's why I was a Republican. But I had that innate belief, and I knew what the 10th Amendment was, and I knew that the federal government did a whole lot of stuff that it wasn't really authorized to do. And it's funny because at that point I really didn't know a whole lot more than that. But as I was doing web searches and just starting to read stuff and kind of get more plugged into what was going on, I stumbled on the 10th Amendment Center website, and I thought, well, these people seem pretty cool. They're talking about the Constitution. That was something that I believed in. I was raised to believe in as a conservative, and the 10th Amendment and limiting government. And they were talking about this thing called nullification, but I didn't really give that much thought at that point. It was more the appeal was more the Constitution. And so I signed up to volunteer. And wouldn't you know it, they said, yeah, Mike, you can work with us. And at first I was going to be at the time we had state chapters, which is something we've kind of gotten away from over the years, but we've gone more to an issue-oriented structure in the way we do our work. But that time we had state chapters. So I was the state chapter coordinator for Kentucky. And that lasted all of about 2 or 3 months. And Bolden decided that I wrote good enough that I should be the communications director. And, it's funny looking back, especially from where I am now, to realizing how little I knew. And I remember one thing really specifically that just absolutely blew my mind. He had given me a bunch of stuff to read. So I was reading like Tom Woods' book on nullification, and I was reading, I believe, Rob Natelson's book on the original Constitution, and I was starting to read things like Bastiat's Law. But I remember the one thing that just absolutely blew me away is I was sitting on my couch, and I was reading a copy of the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. If people don't know what that is, you can Google it. Give it a read, because it'll take you about 20 minutes, and if you've never read it, it will absolutely blow your mind. It's the principle, the foundation of this idea of nullification, that a state has the authority and the power to essentially undermine and stop unconstitutional, overreaching federal actions. So I'm sitting here reading this document, realizing that it was written by Thomas Jefferson, and I'm like, how in the world was it that I went through 12 years of high school, 6 years of college, multiple college-level history courses, and I've never heard of this? It absolutely just blew my mind. So when I started with the 10th Amendment Center, didn't know what nullification was. And then in the ensuing years, I've had the opportunity to be mentored by some incredible folks with a lot of knowledge of history and the Constitution, people like Kevin Gutzman, who I think is probably one of the foremost scholars in the United States on Virginia and its role in the founding of America. People like Tom Woods, Brian McClanahan. I've met Donald Livingston, Clyde Wilson, all these people that have done this academic research that have poured stuff into my head. And, really all I'm good at is writing, so I just regurgitate this stuff back in a way that people can understand. And it's been a cool ride. And, over the years, I've gotten to know a lot of people, including you, Dennis, people that I count as true friends outside of any political work. And Michael Bolden would be chief among them. I consider him one of my best friends. Just an incredible guy with a heart for people, a love for liberty and freedom, and a tireless worker. I mean, you think I do a lot of stuff, Bolden puts me to shame. He basically runs an entire organization that has national reach out of his apartment. And what he's done with the 10th Amendment Center since he founded it in 2006 is absolutely mind-boggling to me. So that's the medium version. I mean, I could talk forever about my political journey, but that certainly wasn't the short version. But That's kind of the medium version of how I got where I am. And then, through that evolution, I went from neocon Republican to pretty mainstream libertarian to now probably most people would consider me, like a radical. I hate the term anarchist because when you say anarchist, people think you're like throwing rocks and burning garbage cans. I like the term voluntarist because I believe in voluntary associations and not initiating force and violence against other people. But when you say voluntarist, that's another word that really doesn't have any meaning for people. So I don't really know what a good word is. If we could come up with a good word, that would be outstanding.
Oh, well, I kind of like libertarian myself, but then it seems like every descriptor has its detractors and its promoters.
Right.
And some have even said we should reclaim the word liberal.
Yeah.
Which was the word for those promoting freedom and personal liberty and personal responsibility.
Right.
But was stolen by the socialists and the authoritarians.
Yep.
A number of decades ago. So that's another situation. Yes, and you're absolutely right about the great work of Michael Bolden and the 10th Amendment Center. And Bolden, of course, also has a heart for parakeets. We don't want to forget that.
Yes, he does.
Right. But I think it is interesting.
In Los Angeles, people always like to make fun of him for being in California. I remember I questioned him on it. Like, why do you live in California? He said, dude, I like my tyranny warm.
Oh,
I said, well, yeah, I can appreciate that. I don't like being cold either. So,
right.
Y'all in Michigan, whew.
Oh, it's beautiful. Because we get the four seasons and the May sun and the blue sky. It's wonderful here. But the other thing I was going to say about with what you folks have done there, you and Michael Bolden together, and with the volunteers and the supporters, really, it's hard to imagine a group that has had more success and more influence, and the nullification movement in general. As you mentioned, of course, Tom Woods and all the great work he's done on that, and yourself, and so many people communicating the ideas, and the ideas continue to spread and continue to have, I think, applicability and also are attractive, even if we look at sometimes with dismay at what's happened in terms of political figures and who people might have gravitated to, and say, well, what happened to the what we were talking about just a few short years ago? But you bring up nullification and the concepts there and interposition, and people do the ideas and the concepts are still attractive, which is heartwarming. And when you look into the history, it is fascinating. As you said, Mike, the Kentucky Resolution of 1798, and of course then 1799, and then there's the Virginia, I guess they called them then resolves, that Madison wrote, and I think Gusson was the one that told us this. Maybe I've got this wrong, but I think he's the one that determined that actually Madison had written that those Virginia ones anonymously.
That's true.
And it wasn't until like another 10 years afterwards that they said, well, actually, he was the writer. And I don't know, was it Randolph or John Taylor of Carolina or somebody who had been the expositor in the Virginia House of Burgesses or
John
something?
Taylor of Carolina. In fact, Jefferson didn't let anybody know initially either. It was actually pushed through by John Breckinridge in Kentucky. And the reason for that is that they were both subject to arrest under the Sedition Act for undermining the federal government by even writing such a thing. So, and it's interesting because you can actually read one of the letters that they sent several letters back and forth during the time that they were drafting these resolutions and pushing them through and discussing strategy. And there's actually one point where, and I can't remember whether it was Madison or Jefferson, I think it was Madison, basically said we need to quit communicating about this through the mail because I'm afraid that they're opening our mail and reading it. And so there was a great deal of concern that simply by raising this kind of political resistance against the Alien and Sedition Act that they could be subject to arrest and prosecution, which is pretty amazing when you think about it.
Everything old is new again, and there you're talking about two future presidents of the United States.
Exactly.
And two of the most influential and famous of the so-called founders, which is intriguing. But this whole idea of nullification, as you described it, and then I guess interposition was Madison's term for the state standing between the people that were resident in the state, not citizens, residents, right? Mm-hmm. between the residents and between what they called then the general government.
Mm-hmm.
And he said it was their right and their duty, which, and they had actually instituted some of these things even before the revolution, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
They nullified the Stamp Act.
Yep. Yeah.
The
political concept goes way back. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, and there were other examples of it too. Yes, where the idea is we don't want to separate, but we're not going to take what you're doing. We're going to make you stop doing it to the general government. And there are a number of examples in history. In fact, one I was going to mention to you because you brought up something as I was driving home from church, listening to the second half of your talk about the identity politics.
Mm-hmm.
And you said, ask these different people. And at certain points in that talk, I was thinking about this thing. Well, I wonder if Mike's going to mention this. And I wondered, will Mike mention the Armenians? And you did.
I did, yeah.
And it's possible you heard that from Tom Woods. He's brought this point up as well as but and others. And we have Armenian heritage on my mother's side of the family. But the famous thing that the people are more well known is what happened with the Turks during the Ottoman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
But there was, in some ways, an example of nullification, though it was a violent example of it. Centuries before that, when the Armenians had converted from Zoroastrianism to Christianity, the first nation to do that, and then the Persian Empire was still Zoroastrian, and then the Shah said, hey, we want you to go back to being fire worshippers and sun worshippers. And they said no, and they had a long war about that. They said, you're the earthly leader, and we're not leaving the empire, but they didn't use the word nullify or nullification.
Right.
But they defended that one right, that one thing that they said they were going to stop, and that's the earliest example I can see of that sort of a thing. But this concept has applicability in many cases, and it's not only the states, but the people of the states, right? And then at some point we say maybe there's this whole idea of nullification. It's really an example. Maybe you think about civil disobedience, but it's doing civil disobedience perhaps on an organized scale within a political society. Yeah. And we're all joining together to defend our rights and the rights of others by doing that. Would that be essentially correct?
Yeah, I think that's a great way to put it. It's a political tool for channeling civil disobedience. I think that's a really good way to put it. One of my favorite nullification stories on an individual level, of course, is Rosa Parks and her refusal to give up her seat on the bus. And, the thing that's fascinating to me about that is that she resisted, but she didn't resist with violence. She refused to get up, but when the bus driver came and said, you need to move to the back. If you don't, I'm going to call the police. She said, go ahead and call the police. And when the police showed up, she went away peacefully and actually went to jail. So she didn't burn the bus. She didn't try to beat up the cop. She submitted to the authority. And I usually talk about this when we talk about the idea of Romans 13 and submission to authority. She submitted to the authority, but she didn't bow to it. She didn't allow it to force her to do something that was against her conscience, something that was immoral or unjust. And, it's interesting because you go back through the U.S. history of nullification, and it was always described as a moderate middle road. And I'm actually working on a new book, which is going to be kind of a handbook for the Constitution. I'm calling it Constitution, the Owner's Manual is what the title is going to be. And I go through the various clauses in the Constitution and explain what they meant within the original understanding as far as the ratification debates and whatnot go. And I was just going back through the chapter on nullification and kind of reviewing that, and I was reminded of the fact that there were a lot of folks, particularly in Kentucky, who were ready to start a violent revolution over the Alien and Sedition Acts. There was actually a militia group in Madison County, Kentucky, which is close to where I live here in Lexington. And they actually passed a resolution basically saying, we're not going to comply to this, and if you come to try and make us, we're going to shoot at you. That was the gist of what they said. And this idea of political nullification was very much intended to be a way to resist without resorting to, shooting at people and violent revolution. So I think it's a very important political concept. And here's the thing that I love about the work that we're doing at the 10th Amendment Center. This stuff works. it works from a practical level. So if you're interested in rolling back centralized power, there's nothing better than you can do than get behind nullification movements, because it absolutely works. And we've seen it on multiple occasions. We've seen it with the legalization of hemp in the United States. That started off with Colorado basically saying, you know what, we're going to completely defy the federal government's ban on hemp farming, and we're going to legalize it here in the state. And people here, without the state laws and without the state enforcing it, well, the feds probably won't be able to enforce it. So that market will grow. And that's exactly what happened. And, as the feds basically lost control and eventually they legalized it on a federal level. That would have never happened if the states hadn't acted first. Same thing with this idea of right to try, which was a movement that started with the Goldwater Institute, and it was a state-by-state effort to allow people to try experimental drugs that had not gotten FDA approval. So it created a state process for people to access these experimental treatments when they're dying. Now, nobody can oppose this. Nobody's going to say, well, I think it's a good idea for the federal government to just let somebody die. So it was a political winner from the beginning. And so eventually, just last year, Donald Trump signed a national right to try law, which kind of rolled back some of those FDA restrictions. But by the time the feds got around to doing it, 40 states had already done it. So again, the federal government has followed the lead of the states. So this is a way that we can actually, practically speaking, roll back the power of the federal government. We can apply this to all kinds of things. I mean, we've seen it work on things like marijuana and hemp and right to try. We're seeing it in asset forfeiture. We could apply the same strategy to firearms if the firearms people weren't so busy trying to sue somebody in federal court. So that's why I'm still involved with the 10th Amendment Center 10 years later, and that's why I'll probably still be involved 10 years from now, God willing, and the creek don't rise, because this is actually practical politics that works. I've seen the fruitlessness of going to Washington, D.C. and calling my congressman and, voting the bums out and suing in federal court. That stuff is people have been doing that for decades and nothing has happened. And yet over the last 10 years, I've seen practical changes through the nullification movement. So that's my pitch for nullification in the work of the 10th Amendment Center. Obviously, I'm biased, but if you're interested, you've never checked it out before, you want to learn more, go to 10thamendmentcenter.com and check out what we're doing. And I really think you'll find that maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but I don't know that there's any political organization out there that's doing more from a practical standpoint to resist overreaching federal power than what we're doing.
And I think that's a great observation. And also, this, as we said before, these are tools that have been used in the past, also in the fight against slavery. Mm-hmm. Northern states like Michigan nullifying the Fugitive Slave Acts.
Absolutely.
And there's a great story that you tell about in Wisconsin about Joshua Glover. It's very moving, and people can go look it up on YouTube and watch you give these talks at Nullify Now conferences.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. Also, in terms of the monetary system, people are looking at this, right. And it's come up with the abortion issue as well. Mm-hmm. So there's quite a lot where people can do the right thing on multiple levels by acting locally and at the state level and using these time-honored principles, which have a moral foundation to them, and also a foundation in American history that is quite noble and invigorating when we look at it. But Mike, it's interesting that you mentioned about this book you're writing now, about the Handbook User's Guide for the Constitution, and we're talking about nullification, and we're talking about other curmudgeons, and the lead curmudgeon, Mark was on here, Mark Kreslins,
right?
He's got a view that I think it's kind of interesting. It's a little bit different, where he believes that the Union is done for all practical purposes. It's I don't know if he used this term, but maybe the experiment failed or things happen over time, sort of Lysander Spooner-esque. Either it didn't, and then we go back and forth about, was the problem the document? Was it the people not enforcing it? So I was going to ask you about that, and then also this idea that I remember Gary North bringing up this point, or a point regarding this topic, that as someone was like, well, secession, gee, how's that going to work? And Mark talks about peaceful political divorce, looking at what's happening with Brexit, re-energizing the spirit of '76 and the principles of the Declaration of Independence. But Dr. North thought, if we do enough nullification, it might be sort of a de facto secession thing in a way that would help bring back federalism. But I wondered what your thoughts are in terms of what Mark's talking about, in that, we need to have radical political decentralization, and also if you could speak to, again, ways that nullification can continue to be a part of that, and where that could possibly lead us in a positive way.
Yeah, I think, I'm pretty sympathetic to where Mark's coming from. I don't know that I'm as pessimistic that we are so far down the road of hopelessness, but I mean, maybe I do. I guess what I'm trying to say is that I agree that if we're going to have more liberty, we're going to have more decentralization. And the mechanism that we get to that, I'm not sure what that looks like at this point. I love the idea of peaceful political divorce. I think that's a great terminology. And I think that is becoming more and more of an option. It's interesting, again, kind of looking back at this perspective over a decade of doing this work. We didn't talk about secession at all in the first few years that I worked at the 10th Amendment Center. You wouldn't have seen the word mentioned in any of our articles. It was something that we avoided intentionally because it was such a loaded term. And if you brought it up, you were going to immediately be labeled as a racist, and people would they would recoil at it. Well, now, 10 years later, we do talk about secession from time to time. You will see that mentioned on the 10th Amendment Center website. You will see us talking about the legitimacy of states leaving the Union. And the reason that we can do that now is because the political climate has changed to such an extent that it's no longer going to brand you as a nut job to mention the secession. You're no longer just some kind of neo-Confederate, whatever in the hell that is. People on both sides of the political spectrum will now at least consider the possibility of secession as an option. And I think a lot of that has to do with Brexit. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that the left has been so horrified by Trump that they're willing to consider the option of, maybe California separating off. And I think the more divided the American political culture gets, the more people are going to be willing to say, screw these people, I don't like them, let's go our separate ways. And so I think that there's more legitimacy in it. I don't think we're there yet, not in the United States. I think there's still too much of the indoctrination of the one nation under God, and that somehow this is some type of political structure that was handed down from heaven and bestowed upon us from on high. But I think that the idea of decentralization is certainly becoming more and more acceptable. And it's interesting, too, in the nullification work. And like I mentioned earlier, that we have moved towards much more of an issue-based structure in the way we do our work. So we really focus on individual policy areas. So we'll work in surveillance, and we'll work in asset forfeiture, and we'll work in healthcare, and we'll work in firearms. And those various policies bring together different coalitions. So, when we're working on surveillance, we work very closely with a lot of folks who would be considered extremely left, the ACLU, and they are the least of some of the radicals that we work with on these surveillance issues, because there is a broad consensus crossing the political spectrum that the federal government and state and local government shouldn't be spying on all of us. So that allows us to create momentum in that area. We don't have to agree on everything, but it creates an environment where we can push forward on an individual issue. And as we do that, it subtly changes the way people think. and it allows them to begin thinking in terms of a more decentralized approach. It was really interesting. It was about 3 or 4 years ago that the ACLU really pivoted on their surveillance strategy to a state and local approach, because they realized that they weren't going to get good outcomes in the federal courts. They weren't going to get, Congress is never going to get rid of the NSA spying authorities. It's not ever going to happen. So if that's not going to work, then we have to go to a more decentralized, more localized strategy. And so we've got lefties who 5 or 6 years ago were calling us racist neo-Confederates for mentioning things like nullification and political decentralization, all of a sudden embracing it. So I think that we're seeing a shift. And I think we're getting to a point where it's at least acceptable to start talking about this idea of peaceful political divorce. And who knows, maybe in another 5 to 10 years, we'll be at the point where it actually starts to happen. And I think that would be for the better. I think the more decentralized that we can be, the better off we are. I've said this for years. The biggest threat to our liberty is centralized, monopolized power. And that's why the 10th Amendment Center focuses on resisting federal overreach, because it is so centralized. It's not to say that state and local governments are great. I mean, they do all kinds of crap too. I'm being sued by my own local government, so I have no love for state and local government. But the fact of the matter is, we have more ability to control it, and when you have decentralization, then you end up with competing political power structures that butt heads against each other and put some checks and balances on. I think I kind of agree with Mark in a lot of ways, is that we're moving in that direction. How that's going to end up playing out, I don't know. But I think nullification is an important part of that, because it creates fertile ground for further discussion about decentralization and about, doing things at a state and local level instead of having everything dictated from on high by Donald Trump or Nancy Pelosi or, one of these fools that's up there on Capitol Hill.
Right. And as you referenced earlier, and we probably should have talked about it a little bit more, but Obamacare was resisted through nullification efforts in a number of states, including here in Michigan.
Right.
We actually successfully nullified the idea of a state health care exchange. Mm-hmm. And Medicaid expansion was temporarily nullified until the governor threw a temper tantrum, and then the Republican governor.
Yeah.
Anyway, and of course that's another interesting story, how frequently in the fight for nullification and the fight for decentralization and liberty, elected Republicans in high office do not provide the kind of support that they might want their voters and contributors to think they do during election time.
Yep.
So that's kind of a fascinating thing. And another point about this too, and I know Mark has brought this up regarding abortion, and so the point comes up that some of these things you try to fight this battle, I'll say on a federal level, though then you might say, well, actually it is national, even though it's not supposed to be. But anyway,
right.
It's very difficult to win. But at the state level, you might be able to win some, and maybe, for instance, on abortion, save some babies in a number of states. Whereas if you keep fighting it in Washington, D.C., nobody gets saved, and then people will bring up an argument, yeah, but what about in the other states? They say, well, if it's either zero or millions being saved, shouldn't, that
right.
sort of thing. But this, I want to talk about the Romans 13 part too, because you mentioned that, and regarding Rosa Parks and others, and this whole idea here, and this gets into the idea with Godarchy and what you're working at with there, and perhaps if you could tell us about that a little bit, and the idea that, and I know it's a slogan that you use, and by the way, now our pastor has me as like a sort of a worship song leader in our church, and so the phrase I always use before we sing the first hymn that I lead everybody in is "No King but Christ," and there's also a Facebook page with that name, and you use that phrase, the hashtag "No King but Christ" at Godarchy several times. Would you please tell us a little bit of what Godarchy is about, and how Romans 13 fits in proper perspective, and how a believer might deal with the political situation currently, and where is our citizenship for Christians?
Ooh, that's a lot. We could talk for about 3 hours on this subject. So,
John's ready for it. He's got the camera rolling.
I'm not ready for it.
Okay.
I'm
A
tired.
brief description maybe, or something.
No, yeah, absolutely. Let me cover a few of these in bits and pieces. Let me first explain what the whole Godarchy thing is. So, Godarchy.org is the website, and it's a side project that I started. I actually started the website. It's been probably about 2 years ago. And it was something that I actually toyed with doing for a long time before that. It was one of those things with people that are believers will understand the idea of wrestling with God over something. Like you feel like you should do something and God's leading you to do it and you don't want to. So you fight God for a while and then eventually you're like, okay, whatever, I'm going to do it. Just leave me alone. So that was kind of the whole process of Godarchy coming into existence. And it really, it's about the separation. You always hear the term the separation of church and state. Well, I turn it around. It's the separation of state and church. Because you mentioned the idea of citizenship, and I think this is key for people who are believers. Our citizenship is in heaven. Our primary allegiance is to the church, not a denomination, but the church universal. And that means that when the laws of Christ come into conflict with the laws of God, when the laws of God come in conflict with the laws of the state, our obligation is to follow the laws of God. And so Godarchy is it's a lot of things. In some ways, it's just a place for me to begin to put together a coherent outline of the way I see my faith interacting with my political beliefs. Because for a long time, most of my life, those things they didn't go together. I had my political ideas and I had my religious beliefs and my faith over here, and those things didn't mix. And as I began to grow in my political understanding, as I became more and more libertarian, as I came to embrace this idea of the non-aggression principle, that it's not moral or ethical to initiate aggression or force against another person, as that happened, I began to realize, there are parallels here in my faith, and these things need to live together. And so, and when you think about it, this whole idea of the non-aggression principle, it's really an extension of the whole concept of the Great Commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. So Godarchy explores these ideas. The other reason I created Godarchy is that I wanted to create an anti-war voice that spoke in the language of the church, because I am just appalled and horrified at the way, particularly the American church, has embraced the state and its wars and the rampant killing, and not only embrace it, but encourage it and cheer for it. And the more I study Scripture, the more I study the teachings of Christ, the more I realize that Jesus teaches us to love our enemies, to not repay evil for evil. And if we're going to follow the teachings of Christ, then we can't at the same time cheer on these wars. These are not wars of defense, they're wars of aggression. And, this offends a lot of Americans, but I'm sorry, that's the reality of the way it is. And so I thought it was important to create a Christian voice that is anti-war. So that was another reason that I started Godarchy. So if you go to godarchy.org, you'll see a whole bunch of articles that I've written, and some of them focus on current events from a Christian/libertarian perspective. There are a number of things that are more philosophical in nature, where I talk about the idea, does a majority have a moral force? Is democracy really a legitimate way to allow people to rule over another? What does it mean to have self-ownership? What does it mean to initiate force and aggression? What is the nature of the state? I explore those kinds of ideas. And then you'll see a lot of anti-war stuff that's just flat out anti-war. There's also a Godarchy podcast that I started. I don't know if I've been going a year or not. I think there's 23 episodes, and I do them bi-weekly. So I guess I haven't been doing it a year yet. But I touch on a lot of different themes on the podcast. I've had a lot of great guests. I've had Tom Woods on. He talked about his book, The Church and the Economy. I've had Scott Horton on to talk about foreign policy. I interviewed an atheist. I've interviewed a Muslim who are both libertarians, and kind of tried to find some common ground with those folks. Just recently, I had Maj Touré that founded Black Guns Matter. So try to just do a lot of things that are interesting, both from a Christian perspective and from a libertarian perspective. Really, honestly, that's my favorite thing that I do that generates virtually no income. If you want to support Godarchy, you can do it. I have a Patreon, patreon.com/Godarchy. A little subtle, not so subtle pitch there. But so yeah, that's what Godarchy is. 10th Amendment Center, that's my work. Shift Gold is how I pay my bills. Godarchy is my passion. That's where I really can just kind of cut loose and write about and talk about the things that really are on my heart and driving me. And in a lot of ways, it helps me to formulate a more cogent, integrated worldview, which I think is important. And then you mentioned Romans 13, which is, as soon as you start talking about libertarianism and Christianity, somebody's going to say, well, Romans 13 says that you have to obey the powers of government. And just quick form, and I did a whole podcast on this. If you go to godarchy.org, go to the podcast section, you'll find the Romans 13. And I cover this in depth. It's about an hour-long podcast. But in a nutshell, I think there's a distinction between submitting to authority and obeying authority. And the idea behind Romans 13 is submission. And that's what you saw in the early church. The early church submitted to Roman authority to the point that they were persecuted and martyred. And we've seen this throughout the history of the church, where there's this submission. But there's not always obedience. Peter didn't obey when the authorities told him to quit preaching. And we can find all kinds of places in Scripture where people of God disobeyed the authorities because those authorities were telling them to do things that were contrary to the Word of God. So I think there's that distinction. And again, I think that Rosa Parks very vividly demonstrates that distinction. She did not obey an unjust law, but she did submit to authority. She didn't resist it with violence. So I think that's kind of what a Romans 13 is getting at. And, I'm no theologian. I could be off base, but I delve into that much more deeply in that podcast, and also on a couple of articles that are on the Godarchy website. But I think it's obvious if you use common sense, and I think we have to use our reason and our common sense when we approach Scripture. I think it's obvious that it doesn't mean we absolutely obey government authority, whatever it tells us to do. Because if that's true, then every person that ever helped a runaway slave was sinning against God. The people that hid Jews were sinning against God because they were disobeying the government. The Nazi soldiers that were guarding the concentration camps would therefore be heroes because they obeyed. Well, that's absurd. Nobody that has a rational mind can come up with that conclusion. So there has to be some explanation for what Paul was talking about in those verses beyond just blind obedience to government.
Right. Well,
so that's the nutshell.
Right. And Christ and the disciples probably didn't obey government, but I guess you could say at certain points they had to submit, and that sort of thing. But
well, the fact that Jesus was crucified indicates that he wasn't exactly considered,
law-abiding,
good Roman citizen or a good Jew either. So, and that's the ultimate example that we have of submission. Jesus Christ, he went to the cross. He submitted even to death, which is the ultimate enemy here. And in submitting to it and dying on the cross and then raising from the dead, he defeated death. So his submission is what won us the victory that we have. So I think submission is really important. And, I'll be honest, I actually I've been struggling with the idea of pacifism. If maybe I'm not called to not even use defensive force. Now, I'm not there yet, but I think that Christians need to struggle with the proper use of violence and what submission means. But that's a whole nother ball of wax we can get into. There's a couple of podcast episodes at Godarchy about that if you want to be challenged, because I guarantee you it'll challenge you.
Yes, I've heard that it's very, very good material. And also, I did want to touch on your 23rd podcast, your most recent one, again on this idea of the identity politics, how it's anti-liberty and it's also anti-Christian or anti-biblical. Maybe you could talk about that just a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a subject that absolutely just grates on my nerves, and I think the left's approach to it grates on my nerves more than anything because they use this term racism as a billy club. If you don't agree with their position, then you're a racist. If you're not, if you you'll still get the, well, you're for secession, so you must be for slavery. You're a racist. It's absurd, and we're seeing this even in libertarian camps where Tom Woods is supposedly a racist, which is absolutely the most absurd thing. I know the man personally. If he is a racist, then he shouldn't be friends with me, right? Given my marital situation and my misogyny, if that's the right word. But anyway, or miscongeniation. I can't ever say that word. I'm married to a black person.
A wonderful lady.
A very wonderful lady, my better half and the apple of my eye. So yeah, the racial politics drives me crazy, but it's not just the left. I feel like that we polarized to such an extent in terms of racial politics that it's very difficult to even have a rational conversation about it because you have, like I said, you have this whole movement on the left, the identity politics, the whole white privilege thing where every single thing is racist. Everything's rooted in race, and you can't get away from it. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you have people, I think it's a backlash in some ways. A lot of people who want to say, well, there is no racism. Racism doesn't exist. Well, I can promise you that it does. I've seen it and experienced it. And I guess the bottom line of where I came from in this podcast is that when you politicize race, you only make it worse. We are not going to solve race issues through politics because politics is designed to divide us up. It's designed to give certain people power, and identity politics is nothing but a political tool for one group or another to use to their own political advantage. And it just it gets all over me. So the approach that I took in the podcast, I talked a little bit about the fact that from a Christian perspective, from the church perspective, there is no place for racism. It can't exist. That it's very clear from Scripture. There is no Greek. There is no Jew. There is no Gentile. There is no slave. There is no male. There is no female. We are all one in Christ. We are all to look at each other as brothers and sisters on an equal plane and an equal footing. And then from a libertarian perspective, I invoked Ayn Rand, and I'm not the biggest Randian in the world, and she's had virtually zero influence on my political thought, other than I read Atlas Shrugged years ago. But she did make a very good point about racism being just an ugly form of collectivism, a primitive form of collectivism, and Ron Paul picked up on that very theme in his campaign rhetoric, and it's true. We are not primarily part of a group. And I made this point in the podcast. We want to lump people together and say, black people do ... Black people believe ... White privilege ... And I mentioned the fact that I can take you to Eastern Kentucky, into some of these poor regions in Appalachia, and show you some white people that would laugh at the notion of having some kind of privilege. It's some of the most economically depressed places you'll ever be. And then I made the point too that all white people aren't the same. All black people aren't the same. My wife's experience growing up in rural West Virginia is eons away from a kid that grew up in inner city Chicago or an urban area of Philadelphia. Very different. They have different cultural experiences, different ways of viewing the world. They may have the same skin color, but they're not alike in their culture or upbringing. And to lump all black people or all Hispanics or all white people or all women into one group, it's nothing but a tool for politicians. And when people buy into it, they're selling out their own identity for the promise that somebody's going to help them because they think, well, this person likes my group.
I guess it's a national or federal example, but it's somebody from this state Congressman Amash, who left the Republican Party,
Right.
and he has people that agree with him, people that disagree with him. Some of the people that disagree with him and are quite vociferous about this on social media have been using identity politics. He's of, interestingly enough, Semitic descent, is where his family's from Palestine and from Syria.
Oh, wow.
And
I didn't know that.
You will see people, or I've seen this, people making disparaging remarks about him and about people from Syria and people from Palestine. Some people misidentifying his religions, as if he were to be a Muslim, that this would be a sinful thing or something
Right.
that, or that would be a disqualifier for anything. And then
Right.
well, actually, he's not. He's Kevin Gussman was one of the people that pointed this out to some of these folks, that his family, they were from the earliest Christian church, and then some will say, oh well, they all have the same cultural outlook. They're Christians and Muslims, but they're from that part of the world. And it's just like, and these are people that would tell you how Christian they are. I've seen it.
Oh yeah, I have too. I've seen that for sure. Not in that specific example, but yeah, absolutely. It's interesting. I talked to some folks, and you're familiar, I'm sure, with Dearborn.
Oh yes, go there frequently.
And you don't hear as much about it anymore. But for a while, they was like, if you go to Dearborn, it's like Sharia law, and it's all a bunch of Muslims, and they're taking it over. And then I came to learn that a large chunk of that population, they are indeed of Middle Eastern descent, but a lot of them are Christians, who are escaping the persecution that came in the wake of the rise of ISIS. So yeah, it's absurd, and that's really, as I think we should, as much as possible. I understand that we have a tendency in the way human brains work. We group things together. It helps us bring order in the world. And there's not necessarily anything wrong with understanding things in groups. I get that. But as much as possible, we need to always remember that we are all individuals. And that's how we should interact with each other. And we shouldn't make assumptions about other people based on their ethnicity or what we assume their religion is, or their skin color or country they're from, because you're almost certainly making wrong assumptions about those people. And it's Ian Rand was right. It's ugly and it's primitive, and we can do better.
And it's anti-biblical.
Yep.
Okay. So, and as Mises said, only individuals think, only individuals act, tying into it, and what Ron Paul, the great Ron Paul, said about this. So I just wanted to make a quick point. I was going to bring it up earlier as we were talking about secession and the likelihood of it. I would recommend for people to study. It's a relatively new science called socionomics, and it's something developed by the people at Elliott Wave International, and Bob Prechter and his friends have done this. And what they have found is that there is a strong correlation. In fact, it would suggest it's a cause and effect, that when mass social mood moves in a certain direction, some things become more likely. And there's an inclusive, optimistic social mood. There's also a pessimistic one. It sort of is hidden in plain sight because people tend not to think of it. But you see it reflected most quickly in securities markets, but you also see it in other things like in the culture, and you see it in certain political developments. And one way is that when the mass social mood gets low enough or negative enough, we see polarization, we see infighting, fighting between groups, fighting within groups, but we also see that it's more likely that there will be secessionist movements. Mm-hmm. And they would suggest that this is one of the reasons why this has become more prevalent lately. Some people would say, well, we might point to an individual, or we might point to one thing happening, but it's actually even more basic than that. And it's possible that over the next several years, as you say, that mass social mood will lead us in that direction. So that's a fascinating thing to study if anybody wants to look into that. So yeah. I do recommend that. But Mike, you've been very generous with your time, and I wanted to tell the audience again, please, as you said, please go to the 10thamendmentcenter.com, godarchy.org, and from there you'll see other things that Mike's involved with. But you'll find it very informative and thought challenging and useful. And as anybody can see it who's been watching this, Mike is a very decent fellow, and he's a good guy to get to know on many levels. And so, Mike, we want to thank you for being the fourth guest on Curmudgeonly Conversation. Thank you very much, sir.
Well, I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure. It's been fun. I like being able to delve into these things into a little bit more depth, and you've been a very wonderful and gracious host, and oh so curmudgeonly.
Well,
this is the best name for a show ever in the history of anything, so I just had to throw that in there.
Well, thank you. Yeah, well, I consider you a very good friend, and your wife Cynthia as well. And so, as we like to say, onward and upward.
Onward and upward.
And for liberty, God bless you, and thank you for all you do.
Peace.
Peace, brother. Thanks, Mike.